All right, so we're talking about inclusive hiring. I'm going to first tell you what we're going to talk about, and then we'll get into talking about the thing that we're talking about. One is that we will introduce the idea of unconscious bias. We'll take a look at a few different kinds of bias, and then we'll get into reviewing a typical hiring timeline and talk about how recruitment can be more inclusive, how we in a collective sense can be interviewing with awareness, what selecting the finalists might look like, and welcoming and retaining new employees, and then taking some time to reflect on the process. So first, unconscious bias is natural, and it is a normal part of the way that we experience the world. It comes from a very deep part of our brain, the part that we started with. And the idea is that unconscious bias comes from the place where we look for danger. Our mind is set to look for danger everywhere. And that is because there are times when we need to run away from things, like saber-toothed tigers. This is not a saber-toothed tiger. This is a cheetah. We don't need to protect ourselves in the same ways that we used to, while there's still dangerous things in the world around us. We have this ability to notice what is creating fear in us, and then deciding whether that thing that is creating this fear response that causes bias is something that we need to actually be afraid of, or is that just something that's kind of a legacy in our brain that is interrupting our ability to create healthy, diverse communities in all ways, in our towns, in our neighborhoods, in our workplaces. The way this can also be framed sometimes is negativity bias. So we're like looking for what's wrong, what's dangerous. And before we get too far along, I wanted to show that about 76% of the population in the United States does believe that racial discrimination is a real problem. And that means that if we're already understanding that there's a problem, we have this opportunity to grow, to see like how can we kind of break down that problem and get to a point where it isn't, especially around hiring. And also wanted to point out that as we talk about bias, it tends to increase anxiety, and there's research around that. I just saw a really great presentation from Dr. Jonathan Cantor, and he showed this image here, and it really shows that kind of regardless of how biased you are, like how much bias is influencing you, the more aware you are of it, the more it impacts, the more it causes anxiety. When we know that, we can say, oh, okay, like this anxiety is happening because I'm uncomfortable with what's happening right now, or I'm uncomfortable with my understanding of what might be happening. That's okay. Like, it's okay to be uncomfortable. It's okay to not know all the answers, but we can continue forward anyway and continue to learn and grow. So unconscious bias plays out a lot in hiring. There was an article in Harvard Business Review looking at women in hiring. They specifically looked at university teaching positions. What you're seeing here is that basically the more women in the pool of candidates, the more likely that a woman will be hired. But if there's only one woman in a candidate pool, very unlikely that she'll be hired. And while I don't think this particular research project got into other demographics or other ways of looking at populations, it seems like a likely situation that could be the case for anybody who is a minority in the hiring environment. So also wanted to just introduce that there are many kinds of bias. We're not going to go into all the different kinds of bias, but you can look into it more with this article from harvard.com. There are 13 in this list, and there's probably other ways of kind of categorizing bias, but it can be helpful not because you need to know like, oh, that was the Horn effect, or oh, that was affinity bias, but just that it might help you see how things show up, how bias shows up and influences decision making. And wanted to give you a specific example of confirmation bias, which is basically this idea of looking for information about the candidate to confirm what you already think you know about them. I'm wearing glasses, someone's wearing glasses, and you think smart people wear glasses, and so you're already looking for me to prove that I'm smart because I've got the glasses on, which, when we're aware of that, we say, oh, that's silly. People wear glasses because they need them to see. But when we're not aware of that, sometimes even little things like that can come into play, where we're looking for the person to show us what we already think we know about them. And there's this great quote in that article that I just mentioned, that in fact 60% of interviewers will make a decision about a candidate's suitability within 15 minutes of meeting them. Some will have done it before the interview even happens, which is pretty, shocking. But first impressions, as we probably all know as individuals, aren't really a good reflection of the person as a whole. I would hate to, I'd hate to think that somebody really understands who I am within 15 minutes of knowing me. So something to keep in mind. Another one is called affect heuristics, which is looking for, using information that really has nothing to do with the candidate's capabilities to decide whether or not you want to hire them. And that can be something like tattoos or hairstyles. It can be their address. It's really things that, again, with awareness, we go, oh, that has nothing to do with whether they're capable or not. Like, I have earrings on right now. It doesn't say anything about who I am as a candidate. And just to throw out a few more, these are a little bit on the kind of similar in a way, but affinity bias is this sense that you have a feeling of closeness with a candidate. And I think Brianna's going to get a little bit into how that might play out in an interview too. And similarity attraction bias, which we hear about that a lot, that people tend to hire people who look like them, remind them of themselves, that sort of thing, which is why you end up sometimes in situations where you have an entire office where people in some way kind of look alike or or have very similar backgrounds or something. And conformity bias is being influenced by peer pressure. So if you are in a hiring panel and one person thinks like, oh, I think this person would be a great candidate because they seem to know a lot about this topic and they seem very interested in something else, but everybody else says, they're wearing those earrings and I don't know. And then the person just kind of goes with it. So again, these are kind of normal, natural things. So if you're feeling like, oh, I've done that, that's okay. I mean, it's not that it's okay if we're hiring people based on that. It's okay to notice that, oh yeah, I have made decisions about people in my head before I really knew them. And sure, in interviews, we don't have a lot of time with people. So it's not like we're going to get a full, well-rounded idea of who that person is and how they will work in the position that they would be hired for. But the real focus here is awareness. So what do we do about bias? We find opportunities to bring in that awareness. Like, oh yeah, I know that sometimes I find out somebody went to the same college as me. I get, they know the things they know something I know about too. Okay, what else? Noticing that bias and moving beyond it and trying to have a more objective way of looking at candidates. But with that, I will hand it over to Brianna.
Thank you. So I guess to now think about, how we go about hiring people. Now, everyone's hiring timeline might look different than this, but this is, we thought about it in phases, and this is as close to, many hiring processes that are out there. So if this doesn't resonate, that's okay. There might be pieces of it that do. As we're gonna take it each time to go through each of these phases to really understand how we can start to be more aware of the bias that has a role in our decision making and the way we design processes themselves. This is just a way to see where are all the points that bias can actually have a bigger role in your decision than the objective place that you want to be making decisions from. The objective and equitable, I guess I should say. So recruitment, that's the first stage. That's sort of where we start to build the candidate pool and start to reach out to folks that we are hoping to fill this role, to find who we're going to bring into the organization. So the way that we can begin to think about it is how, what is included in the job description? How are we writing it? Who are we writing it to? Because the job description is going to speak to certain people and attract a certain kind of population, depending on how things are worded, depending on the level of information that is included in a job description. So the way that we're going to be talking about each of these phases is just what are the questions that we can be asking ourselves to bring that awareness to the forefront. And so, yeah, so that the job description is that main piece. And it's, you know, when we think about inclusive language, who might be turned away from viewing this job description? Are we using a title that is clear, that people understand what it is from the outside, and it's not necessarily internal organizational lingo? When we're writing about the organization and branding ourselves as, you know, whoever, like what our values are within the environmental world, what does that say? What are the values that we're highlighting, and are we connecting those values to someone that we're hoping to recruit? So if the values are not resonating with someone from I guess a population that you haven't been able to recruit yet, that's a question that you have to ask yourself. Like, does this resonate with the local community if you're trying to recruit there? Does this resonate with folks of all different kinds of backgrounds? And so being careful about the way that we speak about ourselves as the organization. Is it transparent, the process for the hiring? Is it transparent about any compensation or benefits? That sort of does help to get candidates excited about a particular role if they can understand, they have a full picture of what exactly is involved in this organization and what are the values, and they can see that very clearly. So that's one way of looking at it. And then another piece that I know Sarah might have more to say on is just this comparison between capability versus qualification. So are we measuring for capability or screening for qualifications? And yeah, Sarah, did you want to like jump in there and say a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. I think in seeing a lot or being part of a lot of applications, or I should say review panels, the actual word qualifications comes up a lot, I've heard, and often it is used at a time when someone's going to be excluded from the next step. And sometimes it is, you know, that the title of their college degree or something is not what was on the description for the posting or something. And it may turn out that that actually doesn't have anything to do with how well they would be able to do the position. So in thinking about that over the years, I have found that focusing on capability, what is the person able to do in the future based on what they're able to demonstrate during conversations with them, or from answering questions in the interview, or through their resume, rather than what is the list of things that what's, you know, what kind of degree do they have and where did they go, or these things that are sometimes referred to as qualifications.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And it's interesting. I actually recently heard a story about this exact thing coming into play, where a person was doing a lot of the work that they were for a role they were applying for, but it was volunteer kind of work. It was off to the side, that it wasn't a part of their official job description, and it wasn't a part of the title that they were able to write on their resume. And so because of that, they were disqualified from being, you know, from getting the offer, despite the fact that they were actually doing all of the things that this new position was going to be responsible for. So it's when we have, you know, decisions like that that are canceling people out because they don't have access to those jobs, you know, the official title. It's understanding who this candidate is holistically and really giving that opportunity to shine through. And of course, like, the decision was not made maliciously, it's sort of made logically, right? Like, in the moment you think, I'm making this decision because it's not on the resume. And that sounds like a good idea until you reflect on it and see like, oh, there might have been some bias, because who gets access to those official job titles in the first place? And you have to like dig deeper into each decision. One thing that Sarah and I were actually talking about, which, you know, if you have any more to say about this too, Sarah, that would be great. But you know, a lot of folks really want to be able to leverage their network in order to find qualified talent, and who I have access to because of who my network is connected to. And that's what we mean by like having your network serve as a gatekeeper to gaining access into the industry or the position or the organization. So yeah, I don't know, Sarah, if you wanted to speak any more to that.
Yeah, sure. I think sometimes the way I've seen it play out is that somebody knows somebody who's connected to the organization that's hiring, and so they might hear that the job opportunity is coming up. They might they might know where to go to look to see if there's a job opportunity coming up there. They might already have references that are associated with that job opportunity. And so there's these multiple ways that they're getting some benefit. And that in itself is not a bad thing. It's just that there might also be a candidate who is equally qualified, or I should say capable, equally capable, if not more so, who never sees the posting because they're not like in the know on that, or they don't know that this particular organization, for instance, always posts in a certain way, or they don't have basically that insider information that helps you just like be a little ahead of the game and be prepared for things as they come in.
Yeah, that's such a great example. And so, yeah, I think that really does even cover the second piece of that, which is who does have access to this posting, what job boards are we using, what tools are we using to spread the word.
I was just thinking as you were, what audience has access to the posting, that is also like something we have a lot of individual influence over too, like in our broader networks, to be constantly encouraging people who have not been exposed to this sort of like smaller network of local environmental organizations, like, oh, hey, follow me on LinkedIn and I will post jobs every time I see them. So you know that at least there's one source of information, or that sort of thing, where you can kind of help get the word out there to people who might not be quite as easy, might not have such easy access to it.
Yeah, definitely. Which, also it's like, are we using job boards that require people to have paid subscriptions and things like that, right? So it's, and which is sometimes common, especially I found in the environmental sector looking for jobs. There's a lot of, environmental focused, sites, like job sites, that it does require a membership or, a monthly subscription fee. So you have to ask yourself, who is that eliminating right from the beginning, from the process? So yeah, Sarah, I don't know if you wanted to talk about the white paper here and the statistics here that we found from the white paper about diversity in recruitment.
Yeah, I think it was just interesting to me that 45% of organizations believe their current recruitment is not effective in increasing diversity of staff. And in our conversations, I brought up that one thing I felt from my perspective is that those recruitment postings and stuff, the questions are written by somebody, and they may inherently be biased, like the actual asks in the recruitment might kind of look for certain kinds of candidates. And so sometimes I think people think if it's a blind recruitment, so you can't see the names or the details, that therefore it's going to be there's going to be less bias. And it really, as we saw, there are lots of different kinds of bias, and that just really eliminates one or two kinds of bias, but that it doesn't necessarily help us get the diverse candidate pool that we know makes for a really strong organization.
Yeah, and I just it's some examples of tools that employers could use to sort of scrub their job descriptions or just like their hiring process overall. Like there are, I thought the language proofing tools were really cool because it does, it's like this third party perspective that can sort of review like what language are you using. And then the other one I thought was like super cool, very like technologically advanced, is like this web crawler software that scans candidates intentionally in networks that are outside of the ones that you currently have. So that you're introduced to candidates that you wouldn't otherwise be introduced to. But something that I thought that is like we could all think about more, and something that we might have influence or an ability to at least have a conversation or start the conversation is, looking at websites and are they accessible to all people. So there has been a lot of conversation about like, making sure that our hiring processes are accessible and meet those legal expectations, but even just the sharing of information is so powerful. Like, are we making sure that everyone can access that information? Do we offer things like text to speech on the website for those that might not be able to adequately navigate the website to get that same information and that insight? So just things to think about. Maybe not something you can decide on by yourself, but maybe something you can start to have a conversation about. Yeah, and something actually that this gamification piece, I realized that's something probably to explain is it's rethinking your hiring process so that it is not like a traditional structure, so that it might grab the audience of those that might be scared away from a traditional structure. What I've learned, and I've actually tried this in a previous role that I held, where part of the program was intentionally to recruit for students with autism. So in order to make that hiring process equitable and also to get them excited and interested, I did have to review, like, okay, how are we selecting our members for the program, and what can I do to make this more of a game, more exciting, so that they can get through and have the same experience as any other person. And so that was actually, I mean, a lot of fun for me, and also taught me a lot about, like, what are the different pieces that we should be considering for people and the barriers that they might be facing. I think that interviewing is what I've seen over the years and through all the roles that I've held, is that interviewing is a skill in itself. And so it's something that, maybe it is a part of your role, maybe it's just something that you do on the side, but it is definitely a skill that is worth investing in, because it does create or limit opportunities for candidates based on the experience that we're able to deliver through those interviews. So if you're, and I've been in roles where I've, been like interviewing candidates and realized like that I just had a terrible interview. Like I didn't ask the right questions. I wasn't like trying to have a conversation. So it happens and it's difficult. And I found that I was maybe more nervous, like interviewing other people than I am going to interviews. And so I just wanted to like normalize that and just say, like, it is a skill, it is difficult, and it is also something we can invest in. And so a few things about interviewing when candidates are invited to this next stage. Something that's really come up in this new sort of remote world that we're working in is like, how can we be flexible with our interview formats and our expectations around how those interviews go? Something that I was thinking about is like, how are we defining professionalism in this new remote setting? And I think that we've all been in conversations where there has been, more flexibility and more understanding that we all are people. And so, like you can see my background right now, like it's not like pristine to like, have a white plain background, because I work at home. It is what it is, right? And of course, like people are parents, people might have pets, people might have family members are taken care of. So there's all these different factors that influence our ability to be fully present in these professional settings. So really considering and reconsidering how we define professionalism and the expectations we set for people will really help to create an equitable experience for all of the candidates, because people of color and people of lower socioeconomic statuses do struggle more with taking care of sick family members, or they might have they might be single parents, like those sorts of things. They might not have access to strong Wi-Fi, although I say that and like my Wi-Fi goes out every every day, so like I don't know that any of us do, right? So it's like, if you think about the things that impact yourself, and just like amplify that for those that might come from disadvantaged circumstances, and how can we just be understanding of that and just bring that understanding and that compassion and that empathy to the interview with you. I think that could, just being aware of it could make a whole world of difference to the candidate on the other side. Yeah, the other piece here is like the time investment of interviews, and so I'm sure we've all been through interviews where it's like you have the phone interview and then you have to go through another phone interview, and maybe there's an in-person interview, and then there's a panel, and then there's a follow-up, and like maybe there's an exercise that you have to take home and complete, and they say it takes a couple of hours, but then it takes you like a week to do it. And so like there's all these things that it is, the interview process is demanding for candidates, and they're not just in your interview process, they're likely in multiple interview processes at the same time. and could be really stressed out about whether or not they're going to get the job offer. So there's like another mental toll that we have to factor in and just recognize like they're human and they also have like these whole separate lives outside of just completing this interview process. And so just thinking about how much time are we really asking from our candidates to be able to participate in the hiring process, and where the bias shows up and where the harm, I guess, can enter in is like there are going to be candidates that might not be able to request that time off nearly as much as someone from a more advantaged place. So it's, if you're not a like full-time salaried employee, you might not be able to request that time off every other day, to make sure that like you're not violating any workplace expectation in your current role. But if you're in like an hourly position or somewhere that doesn't, is not like has like full-time benefits and things like that, you might not be able to take off all of that time. And so just thinking about like what really is the cost to the candidates for going through the interview process, knowing that most of them are not going to make it because there can only be one, right? So just understanding what we're asking of candidates and being aware of that can also like be really essential and can help to bring more people along. And then the last piece there is just standardizing interview questions, which is exactly what it sounds like, just making sure you're asking the same exact questions in the same exact order to every candidate so that you are ensuring that the environment you're creating is equitable, the opportunity for them to really showcase themselves and tell their story is equitable. And also, I guess it just levels the playing field. It really does give people an equal chance to share what they need to share. And it doesn't give anyone an advantage over the other because, you like derailed the conversation and maybe like connected over baseball for like 30 minutes, So just thinking about what, how is that interview experience and what kind of environment are we creating across the board for our candidates. So that's this slide. I don't know, Sarah, if you wanted to add anything or.
I have been in that experience where, and I think it's natural to want to connect with people in interviews. And I wonder what you think about, maybe having something in your interview that is the same kind of icebreaker type question that every candidate gets. So you still get that opportunity of having that feeling of connecting with interviewees, but that you're putting every interviewee at ease in the same way. What do you think about that?
I think that's a great way to sort of navigate this, because it is also important to make sure that the candidates feel a little bit more comfortable maybe than they started. So selecting the finalists, yeah, maybe this is where the magic happens. I don't know. I guess I would say that about like all the pieces. Selecting the finalists, this is, I guess, where like every single bias you could think of that interacts with hiring in this industry, that's really where this comes into play, because it's sort of like, okay, you're at the final stretch, and so this is where maybe you're on a time crunch or something, and so all of these different biases are going to flood in and help to influence your decision, which is what we do not want ideally. Giving unconscious bonus points for familiarity. So when it comes down to narrowing down candidates, and I've definitely been in a situation where it's like had two great candidates, not really sure, I only can hire one, and so you start thinking of like, oh well, that person was just like wearing shoes that I had just bought, and we talked about like how we like to go running, and oh, this person went to my alma mater, so that's really cool. So just thinking about like how are we narrowing down according to the specific, characteristics that we've identified as valuable and essential to the role, and how can we avoid, giving those extra points for things that aren't related at all. Next piece is stereotyping a candidate based on their identity, and so what immediately comes to mind here for me is always like the most upsetting, maybe it's probably not the most upsetting, but one of the most, I guess, upsetting sort of assumptions, which is, when women are in interviews, you know, whether or not they're wearing a wedding ring or et cetera, there's assumptions around like what their family planning decisions might be. And so just thinking about like what assumptions are we making about this person's character or their future decisions, that's really influenced only by the stereotypes I've gathered about who they are or who they identify as. So of course there are a lot of assumptions around women and the expectations of you know, the role that we all play in society. But there's also other assumptions around race, around socioeconomic status. What can we do to just sort of just be aware of what's going on there? The third point that I wanted to talk about is actually one of my favorite things to talk about. I think that when you're thinking about choosing a candidate, there has been this rush of a new trend to talk about like, you know, culture which has just become such an important part of working. I think, you know, especially when recruiting for younger audiences, they tend to ask more questions around culture and trying to understand like what is the day-to-day work-life experience, which is wonderful. But I think that also means that on the other side, as folks on the hiring committees, we're starting to have these conversations around like, do they fit into the culture, which is counterproductive to our ultimate goal of bringing in new voices and new perspectives and new ideas that ultimately strengthen the team. So you know, I've been more pushing to like shift from this culture fit idea to, do they add to the culture? Do they bring something of value? Do they bring something new, something exciting, some new energy, whatever it might be. And maybe it's not energy, maybe it's just like order and structure, and that's what you need, you know, depending on like your challenges and what you're looking for. Trying not to get people to conform to what currently exists, but acknowledging them and valuing them for what they could possibly bring to the team. Which I think just means that we have to be more self-aware and more reflective on the kind of environment that we are creating and currently own as organizations. And then, this last piece, which Sarah and I are talking about, is just making sure that there is a diverse selection committee. And I don't know, Sarah, if you wanted to actually talk about this point.
It's a lot easier to recognize, like for me, it's a lot easier for me to recognize that my bias is at play if there are other people in the same space with me who have different perspectives or come from different backgrounds or something like that, because inevitably people see different things. And that's like one of the really awesome things about diversity is that when we're in conversation and we feel safe to have dialogues about things, we can discover things, one, about ourselves, and also be able to see the candidate a little differently too. And maybe just I'll give one example, which is that it was one time in a I'm being a little vulnerable here, but I was in an interview panel, and the candidate didn't really smile at all, like the whole time. And my perspective, I felt like I think that's a sign that she's like not really that interested in the position, that she just kind of, maybe she's just like not enthusiastic about being part of this team. And there was somebody else on the panelist who was like, who was had a really different perspective. She felt like, oh, I think she has the capabilities that we're looking for, and that basically, you know, called me out on maybe my like extroversion bias, that maybe I was looking for a certain like gregariousness that I identified with a little bit. So, and just, I mean, I think it can show up in things that are kind of subtle that can make a big difference. Oh, and to follow through with that, we did end up hiring her. She was awesome. And she was very enthusiastic too. So everything that I had in that one moment come up with that conclusion was a totally false conclusion. So I was so glad that there was somebody else in the room with me, someone else talking to her, because we had a great result.
That's a great story. Thank you so much for sharing. So this, of course, like we are talking about inclusive hiring, in this session, but I think that when Sarah and I spoke, we felt that it was important also to speak, you know, the hiring piece doesn't end once you send the job offer out. It actually keeps going, right? So the welcoming, which is like the onboarding piece, can't talk about hiring and investing all this time in a candidate without speaking about retention as well. So that's sort of where we're going with this slide. And so with this welcoming piece, it is really, I think that it can be hard to spend the time, like to find the time, I guess, to create a really thorough onboarding process. And I know like a lot of the companies that I've worked for, and even like in positions where I've been hiring like seasonal staff or something, the onboarding sometimes is like just like really not, it's not well thought out. It sometimes isn't that organized. It's sometimes just like, I just need you to start and help because we have a lot of work going on. It's the busy season or whatever it is. But really investing in that process and what that looks like for new employees is so essential. Thinking about like, are the environments that we're setting up, is the steps that they're going through, is that making them feel like they're a part of the team? Is that including them in the camaraderie? Are there opportunities to connect with other staff, other colleagues in a way that's not about, you know, like is not formal, is not about like the work that they are responsible for. So thinking about that, and I think what really helps me to like think about this too is like, what does the onboarding process say about your organization's values? You want to make sure that they walk away thinking like, this is a great place. I learned this about this organization and they represent this and they do this every day. And that's when you're building that employee loyalty, which is becoming more and more a concern for organizations where, you know, people will leave, people will find other opportunities, especially younger audiences. As a self-identified millennial, like now I'm being vulnerable. As a millennial, it is, you know, we would be the generation that would decide like, this is not for me, I'm going to leave. And so any effort you can spend investing in this would be great. But then that also sort of bleeds into the retention piece. Are we like, how can we make sure that it's not just these like once a month meetings where we're allowed to have authentic conversations, but how can we change the way that we're doing things and review it so that, you know, people feel willing and safe to be authentic in all of the spaces they're invited to. And that's a really difficult thing to do. And I don't know that any organization does this perfectly. I would be shocked, but I would love to meet that one day. I believe that one day it will happen as long as we are just like constantly thinking about how we can change a certain space, how we can change the way a meeting is run, how we can change the way an event is organized, so that people can really like, you know, have their voice heard. And then the other piece, which I think is also really valuable to mention, is just like, you know, investing in that person as, you know, as a professional. So like, you know, maybe there's not a ton of funding to do professional development training and things, but maybe, you know, having, you know, showing that you care about how they're growing, and maybe there's just, you know, regular meetings that you're having, you're checking in not just about the progress on the project or the, you know, whatever is going on, but also about like who they are, what their goals are, and how you can align what they're doing with those goals and help them to grow into professionals. Being equitable across the board, thinking about, you know, are we paying equitably across a certain position across the board? Are we giving equitable access to promotions and the opportunities to, you know, to move up within the company and, you know, take on more leadership positions. The last piece here is just the reflection part, which I guess like would make the little timeline arrow more of like a circle. But you want to reflect on the process, and you want to reflect on your contributions, where you can change, things like that. I think it's an important, I mean, to any project, reflection is hopefully a part of what you include in an important step. And That's definitely what I've seen in the environmental industry. Like there is this huge focus on reflection and processing and debriefing together. And so it should also be something that we're doing when we're thinking about hiring. The way that I think about it is how are we reassessing the role? You know, when we are bringing people in for performance reviews or something, or even just, you know, thinking about how we're doing as a program or as an organization. Did we create expectations that like are consistent with the resources we've been able to provide this person to complete all these tasks, right? So I think that like something that I really love about this environmental world is that it's very visionary, it's very like optimistic and like up in the sky, which can be great, but that also can put a lot of pressure on people on the ground that have to do a lot of the work. So just being realistic there, setting people up for success from the beginning. And also just constantly reviewing that role to allow more chance for ownership and growth. The other piece is just understanding the hiring process. So that's like collecting, which I think is really essential. And I think a lot of organizations could really do this. I think it's possible just to ask candidates like, what did you think of the interview process? What did you think of the experience in total? And not just someone that you've hired, but like especially going to those that have made it all the way and then been rejected for whatever reason, or made it half of the way through, like getting their feedback on, you know, how did you do? How did this make you feel? Did it feel like you had the support you needed, or had access to, you know, ask questions and things like that? You can never go wrong with asking for some constructive feedback.
Okay, so what now? We've gone through bias and put out some things to think about in terms of the hiring process at the various stages, and really want to invite you to really look at this quote, which all around the country, people are affecting real change with small actions, change that improves the lives of people of color in their towns and cities and weakens and oppresses the system. Racial oppression starts in our homes, our offices, our cities, and our states, and it can end there as well. We can do this together. And that's from So You Want to Talk About Race. When we think about bias, we become more aware of the way it impacts these various parts, these very tangible opportunities to make some change, and that those changes really make a more inclusive environment. And that's how we get to a more diverse work environment and a stronger one. And wanted to put a special thanks to Tacoma Creates for helping to make this possible.